When lockdown started last year, March, I was trying to do online learning and struggling with a lot of anxiety. And my therapist told me that during this time of COVID-19, the best thing that we can do is focus on the small victories.
If you could mobilize a group of people, what movement would you mobilize and why?
I would call my movement the mindful movement. Suicide is one of the leading causes of death between people aged 15 and 29. 1 in 3 people are expected to suffer from mental illnesses in their lifetime. So I believe that mobilizing people to strive for mental health would actually fix so many social ills in our society. And that is what I would mobilize.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. And how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Cool. Well, I am looking forward to this conversation. Thank you so much for inviting me and for partnering with SADAG in this regard.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. It's going to be such an informative session, and I'm so glad that we're partnering up together with one of the biggest organizations in the country.
Awesome. And I think that it is a really worth noting and logging that we appreciate that you've chosen to a huge extent not just to be an ambassador and partner with us, so actually to put this very important conversation on the map for everybody. And so we have great gratitude for that.
No, it's such an important topic during this time because, especially with COVID-19, people losing livelihoods, loved ones, and jobs, and stuff like that. It's quite important for us to engage in this conversation because the mental health issues that exist in our societies have exacerbated extremely. So I'm so glad that we're having this conversation because a lot of people have been asking for it. A lot of people have been asking to learn, and I think it's time for me as well to learn. I think in the conversations that we've had, I've learned a lot about language and just mental health in general.
Yeah, and I think that following from the previous conversations that we've had, I think it is important to take a very kind approach to how do we speak about this. And I was thinking about it this morning, and I was thinking, well, one of the reasons that there might be still a lot of problematic language is that we don't speak about it enough.
We don't.
And so it's very hard to actually know what works and what does not work, what is still appropriate and what is not appropriate. So this in and of itself, and the work that you and I have been doing leading up to this, is such a huge step in trying to even get the languaging, which is so important, accurate.
And like we said when we spoke, it's a learning process. So we can talk about it today, but implementing it is another step. I find myself learning every single day, so I'm looking forward to this and just to carry on the conversation of mental health.
Awesome. I also understand it's your inaugural Mindful Mondays.
Yes, so you're my first guest.
So a very big congratulations to you for being able to set it up and get it started. And I'm glad to be the first guest. I hope that I'll have beginner's luck in this regard and we'll have a smooth conversation.
Yes. Should we get started?
Let's do it.
Cool. So I think the first thing that's quite important is differentiating between what mental health is and mental illness. So yeah, those two distinctions are quite important.
So I mean, it's very difficult, I suppose, to really try and separate them out because in many ways they are very linked. So maybe where I will try and make distinctions, you'll forgive me if they're a little bit superficial in many ways. Though actually this is mental health. This is what you're doing is mental health. These conversations are mental health. They are the conversations that we need to be having in order to promote well-being, and the conversations that we need to be having in order to catch mental illness where something has gone wrong. So the proactive stance that, for example, you've taken, where we might be able to know what it is that we can do, not even from a position of being of struggling a lot or having any sort of diagnosis, actually just from a position of bettering ourselves as mental health. A little bit on Friday when we spoke, I said that it was something about mental health which can feel like gym. So a lot of us will know that you can go to gym without any sort of indication. You can do it as an activity to better yourself, to kind of invest in yourself, to improve in your well-being. And mental health is exactly that. The things that you do on a daily basis, ongoing in order to improve your health. The difference between mental health and mental illness is also almost captured between the difference between surviving and thriving. And a lot of people are mostly familiar with just surviving and find it difficult to know that actually you can go on to thrive and be better. And the last thing that I want to say in that regard is that it is everything all the way from going to a psychotherapy because you want to get to know yourself better and maybe attend to some things that are there that are not necessarily causing you the biggest of life's issues. So if you were to be informed about them, if you were to have better insight, you might be a better person. All the way through to, for example, a cup of green tea on a Monday afternoon to kind of help zone in the mindfulness of this conversation, taking time off, making certain that you have a healthy sleep schedule, and so on and so forth. So that's mostly mental health and mental wellness, and something that I actually call mental wealth because it requires investment that will pay out in the future. And mental illness is the whole category of diagnosable condition, both psychological and psychiatric, that most people struggle with, that need a professional in order to assist them to get through those difficulties.
So I think essentially it's just about knowing that in as much as physical health is important, mental health is quite important too. Because some people think it's okay to just be, like you're saying, go to gym and invest in that. It's quite important for us to also invest in our mental health as well. And the distinction is quite important because people call them mental health issues. Is that something that we can say when referring to mental illnesses, or just referring to it as a mental illness?
So I suppose it's actually quite a nice shift that we're seeing globally, is that people are now speaking a lot more about mental health issues as opposed to kind of exclusively mental illness or psychiatric illness. And I think part of the reason it's shifting to languaging it as mental health issues is to know that actually the position to begin with is health. And now you have a difficulty with your health. And I think that it's a political shift that is global in trying to put a few things into the conversation. For example, one of them is knowing that it's a health issue, actually, and it's diagnosable and treatable like most all other health issues. You're not being silly or just lazy or whatever the case is that a lot of people would label and mislabel. And
that's the misconception, because when people are struggling or suffering from mental illnesses, there's so many different connotations to it, where people just don't understand what is actually happening with the mental health aspect of it. And for me, it became such a serious issue when I realized the alarming stats in this country. I read that 1 in 3 people in this country are expected to suffer from mental health in their lifetime.
Yeah. And I'll tell you this much, that's still conservative. So we're putting it down at 1 in 3 because Africa Check and Fact Check will come after us if we say more, which they should, I think. But in reality, we know it's very conservative. In reality, we know that more people than not actually, throughout their lifetime, will struggle with some sort of psychological distress or psychiatric condition or illness. And then it's probably closer to 3 and 4 in very many ways. And the better we're getting at recognizing it, treating it, and getting people to know that there's something wrong with them and that they're struggling with something inside and that there's help. Actually, we're seeing the numbers go up a lot.
I have a question with regards to that. I mean, when most people struggle with mental health and coming to terms with the fact that they have a mental illness, it's always saying there's something wrong with me. Is there any way that we can reframe that in a sense where it's not something wrong with you? Because I think that takes away from people trying to get help as well. Is the languaging correct there?
Yeah, so I suppose, and thanks for bringing that up, because it's incredibly important that we find a really nuanced position. On the one hand, we do have to kind of separate the person from the illness, and whether it's the person from the diagnosis or the maybe very ordinary, for example, grief and bereavement that they might be struggling with, and it's not all you. And that in itself is therapeutic, by the way. That in itself is part of what any sort of professional, any sort of mental health care professional would also have to work with, because if it's all of you, you can imagine how determining it is to your identity. So perhaps you are struggling with something. Might be a lot more accurate. And that then also allows us to know about the capacity and the power to do something about that struggle that is inside of you, as opposed to that you are the struggle. And then you also have to suffer the shame of feeling like it's all you, as opposed to perhaps it's inside of you, it's part of you.
And going back to the stats, I've been getting a lot of questions about who does mental illness or mental health affect. A lot of people have brought up the question as to how sometimes people believe that children can't be affected, or the older generation can't be affected, that it's a specific certain group of people that would struggle with mental health. Like, who does it affect?
So I love speaking on that for several reasons. Maybe also because I love speaking. So I think the first thing is to know that it affects everybody. It affects everybody across age, across gender, and I'm really using a non-binaryism, across race, culture. There's something so universal about this. Everybody is affected by it, and everybody has the potential to be affected by it. And then another conversation that you're introducing is that about children. So I think I noticed that your next Mindful Mondays will be focusing on teen suicide, which is really great, and it's a topic that I also love, because that's a unique kind of cohort or age group, which it does affect, and we know that it affects them a lot. And in fact, my recent conversations have been about that it's affected them, or they've been affected by COVID and the lockdown much more than people realize. So that's a conversation in and of itself. And yes, it absolutely does affect kiddies. What a lot of people will be surprised to know is that one of the youngest kiddies that I've ever treated was 2 years old, which is really tiny. And there's this imagination that kids do not get affected by anxiety or depression or trauma. And of course we know that they do. And part of what's helpful is that we know that it presents very differently. So sometimes it's difficult to catch until you know how to look for it. All the way through to geriatrics, so old people. And they have their different categories of how it affects them. It could be a depression which is related to a dementia, or kind of a depression when you're facing end of life, or adjustment difficulties when people retire. So, throughout one's lifetime and lifespan, there are unique ways that it can affect somebody, but it affects everybody.
And I like the fact that you brought up the age of the 2-year-old who you treated, because I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and one thing that became clear is that most people suffer from mental health issues or mental illnesses at a very young age. We just don't have a name for it. That's the thing. We just don't have a name for it. And then the older we get, we think these are new issues, or these are new illnesses, whereas we've just been suffering with them for the longest time, or struggling with them for the longest time, and we just didn't have a name for it. Especially now during COVID-19, how do parents best help children who are struggling during this time? Because like you said, kids can suffer from depression or anxiety.
Yeah. So kind of one of the really important points that you make, and I think, thanks for making it, because it's a huge one, is that once you've been in something for long enough, it looks like a normal, right? And it feels like a normal. And that can be incredibly dangerous, because then you do not know or recognize that actually you should not be feeling like this.
Exactly.
Life should not be this hard. Life is already tough and difficult. It should not be difficult for you to wake up every single morning for 20 years of your life. It should not be this anxiety-provoking to go into a presentation, or to even kind of go into a social setting. The once that has been normalized becomes your new normal, and then you're forever normal. And it becomes even more difficult to treat also from our side, because you're not recognizing it. And secondly, it's been so normal, it takes so much work to get out of it. So these conversations alone are incredibly helpful for a lot of people who might be struggling with something and did not know that it was a struggle, actually. And I think your series will really help people to know, like, oh my goodness, I thought that it was just me that was experiencing this. So actually it's something that I need to attend to. Very briefly then, your second kind of question, which is a topic that I love speaking around kiddies and mental health, because it's a hugely neglected topic. I've found that what's happened over lockdown is that the adolescent has struggled because to be isolated, which is what we are being asked to do, we need to do. It's counterintuitive to be an adolescent. Actually, to be an adolescent is to be out there and to be social, to be with your peers, to kind of break away from the family group and then start to make friendships. And that has been very disrupted. And so adolescents and young adults have been really impacted by this. And then there's the more unique kind of younger kids impact and effect. And again, there are a series of them. So one of the difficulties that you know is that the kind of between 4 and 9 and 12 and so on and so forth, there's actually a need to get out there and explore, because that's how kids learn, right? To be independent, to really try and work things out for themselves. And that has been disrupted too. That on top of the fact that if you remember when you were young, that you will remember how much longer things felt, right? So a week in school could really feel like a month, actually. And so we've been in lockdown, and adult brains and hearts can know that this was long. For the younger kids, it's almost been like dog years for them. It's been a long time, and that can cause a lot of difficulties inside. So I've just given 2 age groups and 2 kind of clinical examples of how it is that lockdown and COVID would have affected this young population. So I hope we can begin to see, that different age groups have different, I suppose they negotiate very differently what they're struggling with. And then the second one is these kind of small things that we might take for granted, but that are actually incredibly big for young people especially.
And on that topic, like in terms of mental health in general, how does it affect people? Like you mentioned earlier that some people may just think you're lazy or you just don't want to do anything. But how does it, in a quick summary, like how does it really affect people if you're struggling from a mental illness?
So again, if I kind of try to condense many years of a response into something very, very little, let me say the following. The first one is that we must really appreciate that it has a deep adverse impact and effect. A lot of people will say, why do you treat people? Because people suffer and they struggle when they have certain symptoms. And that suffering and struggle can really be painful. It can also make doing things so much harder to the point that people just do not want to do it anymore. But it can really also take away people's lives. And I want to really highlight that on the one hand is that it can take away a person's ability to live life, to thrive, to get out there, to work, to have relationships, to live, laugh, and love. It can take that away. And to have your life taken away is such a tragedy. And this is one of the ways that it impacts. And then, of course, the second way it can take away life is literally through suicides and people taking their own lives, and even homicides. I think that our high rates in South Africa of homicides, whether it's road rage or in the family, is also absolutely linked to mental health difficulties that our population is facing. So how does it present? It presents in a person not being able to live in the way that they should. It presents in them struggling a lot more, suffering a lot more, experiencing pain. And it presents in the loss of life in the sense that one is no longer living the best life. And really, I mean that. But also, unfortunately, because we know of the high stats of suicide, it also presents in the loss of life in that way.
So if we're bringing it back to the normalization, like you're saying, some people we normalize the feeling or the feeling that we don't understand within us. So if we're bringing it back to that, and how do you treat a person who's been suffering from depression, for example, or anxiety, for example, for the longest time, who's at the brink of, I don't know what life is about anymore. I don't know what use there is to live, because they know that feeling, and you're trying to introduce a new feeling, a feeling of life, a feeling of healing. How do you go about treating, or what resources are available to those people?
Yeah. the first thing maybe that's also really helpful is because I recognize how I answered the previous question is to say that, of course, there are particular symptoms for particular illnesses, right, that I suspect in the next couple of weeks or months or your endeavor, your journey with this, you may tease out. So I suspect you will have a conversation particularly on depression and or particularly on even high functioning depression, which I think is a topic, or particularly on anxieties and so on and so forth. And then we'll get to know the particularities of how those things.
I think I just learned something. Now I was saying a high functioning depression. I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, high functioning depression is again one of the topics that I really love to speak about, because I think that it's really not understood, and though it's one of the most prevalent difficulties that a lot of young professionals actually suffer and struggle with. And again, it's just no name for it. And because it's also not in the DSM, it's not like in the book that we use to actually give diagnosis, it's very hard to catch. Though some of the core symptoms or categories are people who actually are not severely depressed, so they're still going to work and they're still doing some social activities. However, if you speak to them, they'll tell you how difficult it is to get themselves to do all of that. And sometimes the difficulties are literally waking up in the morning so that you can go to work and feeling like no amount of rest or sleep is giving you rest, all the way through to the anxious difficulty of having to really prep yourself very hard in order to even be social and to do things that you used to enjoy because you no longer enjoy it. So and everything in between, like difficulties of concentrating, energy. Those are some of the symptoms, I suppose, in a very quick way of high functioning depression.
Sorry, carry on. I was gonna go back to that question because I disturbed you.
Yeah, cool. To go back to it a little bit, one of the things that I say is that look out for a change. So oftentimes, the first thing that you'll notice is that something has shifted, something has changed, and it can be in a whole host of different places. It can be in mood, it can be in how a person socializes, it can be in appetite, sleeping patterns, irritability, withdrawal, or and so on and so on. Look out for change. That is oftentimes the biggest indicator that something is up. And then, of course, if you go to a professional, which I'm going to get to right now, then you'll be able to be assisted in terms of what these changes mean and what does it say. So there are lots of different ways that you can get assistance, and this is where the good news comes in, is that there are lots of avenues for assistance. We have all the way from the psychiatric to the kind of psychological arenas, and if I speak in those two categories, from the psychiatric, we have psychiatrists who are doctors who do more training after they qualify, specializing specifically in psychiatric conditions. And oftentimes they will look at things like bipolars, major depressions, or personality disorders, and anxiety disorders. And they can even specialize in terms of adults and children. And those people can really help. You can also consult with your very well-informed local GP as a way to begin the conversation, because sometimes people find it really scary to start this conversation. And to start it with somebody you're familiar with, like a GP that you're going to, can be incredibly helpful. And actually, sometimes the GP can resolve it, and the GP will know where to refer. And then on the other side, you have kind of counseling, therapy. And there too, you have counselors who will help you oftentimes with mild psychological distress, such as adjustment disorders, you're starting something new, so on and so forth. And then you also have psychotherapists who will help you with your more severe psychological distress, and are specialists trained to use talk therapy in order to assist you with your difficulties. And then you have our other allies, like occupational therapists, which are also really great. And we know that a combination of all three can be really helpful. So medication from a doctor and regular visits, psychotherapy from a psychologist or counselor from counseling from a counselor, and occupational therapy to help you adjust things in your life is a really great combination. It's a winning combo.
One big question that I got and that I have as well, I think I asked you this, but then for the interest of the people, What happens when you're misdiagnosed? Is there any point that these professionals can misdiagnose you and then you end up taking medication for something that you probably do not have? Because I think a lot of people fear that. Like, what if I go to a doctor and they tell me that I'm suffering from 1, 2, 3, and then you find out that that's not really the case? Is there a point where there is a misdiagnosis from these professionals?
Yeah, absolutely. There can be misdiagnosis, and it does happen. Right? And when we were having this conversation, one of the things that is important to add is that it can happen because it's so difficult to see. Right? It's unlike a lot of your other kind of health difficulties where let's do a scan or let's draw blood and do blood tests and so on and so forth, and then you can print out the result and you go, well, you can see the bone is broken here or there's this lesion here. It's very difficult to see because it relies upon actually the conversation and the relationship between the professional and the person in order to figure it out. So misdiagnoses do happen. And that's something that we need to try and account for. And it should not discourage you to know that you're misdiagnosed. It can be incredibly frustrating, of course. And at the same time, because of the nature of this beast, it really can happen. Some of the ways to kind of try and account for misdiagnosis is to try and see the right people, reputable people and respected people. And that's all the way from the right profession. So even though, and I'll give you the stat, even though we do not have enough psychiatrists and psychologists in the country, it may be important that actually you do seek out a psychiatrist or a psychologist who would really know what to look out for, and then also really know how to proceed. And also you can check people out, right? You can check out, I mean, almost the same way as you may do a little bit of background before you go to the or any other service provider. You can also do that and see the track record and see how they're functioning. Where it gets a little bit tricky is that oftentimes you'll find a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists will discourage second opinions because of very many clinical difficulties. It's not a bad thing to go get a second opinion. And it's well within your right, you're well within your rights to do that. And sometimes it can be incredibly helpful to either have something confirmed or actually see more accurately.
And this goes back to the resources available, because as we're speaking about psychiatrists and psychologists, there are a lot of people, especially on this live, especially in this country, that cannot afford to see a psychologist and a psychiatrist. What other forms of, what other resources are available to them to get help? Because the one person may be able to afford therapy, but the other person doesn't. So how do we get to a point where, or what resources are available to those people that cannot afford a psychiatrist or a psychologist?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the first place to begin, and again, I'm taking advantage of being your first guest so I can prescribe topics for you for the future. This is saying that in the future you may want to have a conversation around the cost of not getting help. You know, it can seem it can seem so expensive to get the help, though I can assure you it can cost you so much more not to get the help in the long run. Now, we know that all the way from WHO stats that show, for example, institutions and companies that do not invest in mental wellness, that it actually eventually costs them through absenteeism, burnout, high turnover, all the way through to a personal human cost of the life that you cannot live if you cannot live a life properly. You know, so there is that cost. And the second one is, if I was trending it, I would really kind of try to make this trend, is to speak about mental wealth. So once again, you know, most things need investment. They're going to be worthwhile, right? And you are investing in you, and I cannot imagine a better investment for many people to make. And kind of reaping the rewards in the future will absolutely be in your best interest. So it can seem expensive until you consider the cost of not doing it. It can seem expensive until you also redefine it and reframe it as an investment in yourself, and then it's kind of very ordinary. However, we do have problems in South Africa. I mean, I'll give you the stat. Currently, there's something like one clinical psychologist to 100,000 people. So that is Soccer City or FNB Stadium packed to capacity just about, and then one person having to treat all those people. Now that's alarming. and we need to attend to that. By the way, this is one of the ways we're attending to that, because one of the benefits of Mindful Monday is that actually it will help. That's alarming, and we need to attend to that. By the way, this is one of the ways we're attending to that, because one of the benefits of Mindful Monday is that actually it will help people who may not be able to access a psychiatrist or a psychologist, that actually can access it through these platforms. So that's great. Speaking about it, making it a social conversation, and making it an everywhere conversation means that we do not have to wait for the 100,000 to 1 ratio in many ways. The second one is to also really know what resources are out there. So outside of the private kind of healthcare system, the state does offer at primary and tertiary and most local clinics an opportunity to be seen either by a psychiatrist in training, or somebody who's consulting with a psychiatrist themselves, and a clinical psychologist. Most places actually have that, and there might be long waiting, so it might be worth kind of going there and knowing that you can access it. And then the last one are your NGOs, and of course, as a SADAG, this is our commitment and advocacy for mental health. They'll also actually access for mental health, and whether it's giving a call, sending an SMS, dropping an email, in order to access a trained counselor on the other side, actually. That is also really available, because we do know that the resources are very limited.
No, I think that's one important thing that people need to know about the fact that organizations like SADAG exist where you can get help. I know that you even have like a 24-hour helpline, if I'm not mistaken, for people that really, really need it. But then a lot of people don't know about that. I get one question that I've been getting a lot is mindful. Why are we doing Mindful Mondays if it's not going to reach the people that need it the most, people in rural and remote areas? And I think starting this conversation is a very big and important step in destigmatizing mental health and teaching people about mental health. And another thing about mental health is that people just want to know that they're not alone. Because when we're suffering, we just think, oh, I'm alone in this. That's why they call it a silent killer, because you keep it to yourself. You keep it to yourself thinking that there's no one else. But like you're saying, Mindful Mondays brings a whole community together where you get to learn, where you may even find resources like knowing that you can go to SADAG in order to get help. And especially now during COVID-19, a lot of questions that I've been receiving is how has COVID-19 impacted mental health in general, like in a broad scheme of things?
It's had a massive impact. So I have only bad news in this regard. It's had a huge impact. If we just look at anecdotally, just the phone calls that we were getting, I think in the last 3 months of last year, between phone calls, SMSs, emails, and that type of people reaching out, it was about 500,000 points of contact. Now, we are just one organization, and we're one of the biggest in the southern belt of Africa, though we're just one organization, and a lot of people still cannot reach us because of very many difficulties. So if you consider that we were at a point fielding about 1,500 phone calls a day, with 1,500 different people, though in addition to that, there were all the other communications, you get a sense that actually people are struggling with a whole host of things. And there are COVID and lockdown unique difficulties that people would have experienced and are experiencing, including the great deal of uncertainty and the anxiety that comes with that. As well as for some people, the trauma, so post-traumatic stress disorder, something else that I speak about around COVID, whether it's the trauma of having been ill yourself, which is huge, or the trauma of having to look after somebody who was ill. It's really big. And into the future, unfortunately, what we'll also begin to see is a great deal of grief. As we're losing people and as we're coming to terms with that, there will be a lot of bereavement that we'll have to attend to. So COVID has had a massive impact, and it's still continuing to do so, by the way. So, I always remind people, it's novel, and we have to always call it the novel, to remind ourselves that we're getting to know, and learning on the fly, and so on and so forth. All of its impact, and as we're getting to know, we'll publicize it, and we'll speak about it so people can recognize if they're struggling with something, and then, as you were saying, know they're not alone, and know what to do. That's one of the that's the biggest thing about COVID, is that really what it's done is it's forced people into positions where they may either have an underlying mental illness come up, or it can almost mimic one. So to be by yourself, isolated at home, not see people, not leave the house, are some real symptoms actually that can be associated with severe anxiety and agoraphobia or severe depression. You know what I'm saying? So once you force people to do that, it's almost like you're also making them struggle with some of the symptoms of certain mental conditions, psychiatric conditions.
I had to learn very early on, like when lockdown started last year, March. I was trying to do online learning and struggling with a lot of anxiety. And my therapist told me that during this time of COVID-19, the best thing that we can do is focus on the small victories, which means getting out of bed. That's become a victory in itself, taking a walk, cooking, and things like that. And the reason I'm saying it is that I implore people to actually just focus on the small victories. Sometimes there's not much you can do during this time. If they say level 5 lockdown, we are stuck in the house. We need to find avenues to just find healing and to check in with ourselves. So I think it's quite important for all of us to actually focus on the small victories. So if you are struggling to get out of bed, when you get out of bed, that is a small victory in itself, and eventually they'll build up momentum into to the bigger victories. And just before we end it off, there are a few questions that I had asked some of my followers. I'm just gonna ask you a few of them. One big one that came up was mental health in the Black community and how it's considered a taboo.
Yeah, and that's a massive one, and again, one that we'll have to come back to really exhaust it. So I'm glad you've gone there, because it can be potentially so controversial. One thing that we know a few things. The first one is mental health will affect anybody, including people of color. And people of color historically have been denied access to mental health services. So part of what has then developed historically is in fact an intuitive or an adopted denial that we can struggle from things, because we were not afforded necessarily, and I really include everybody under the umbrella of person of color, we were not afforded the resources to treat it. And so what you do is, you imagine you do not suffer and struggle from it, so to speak, as a collective, in order to really survive. So we know that everybody can suffer and struggle from it. And we then have to undo very many years, which is probably centuries, if not decades, or I'm not certain, of that messaging, so that we know that we too are vulnerable to all sorts of psychological distress and psychiatric conditions. And however, we also really deserve to get the treatment that is out there. It is not a privilege actually to go see a psychologist or a psychiatrist. It's a right, it's a human right. And rewriting the narrative really has to consider your entitlement to be happy and healthy, which might mean that you have to override years of saying this is a white thing. Absolutely not. It's an everybody thing. It's a worldwide thing.
Exactly. I think one thing that we spoke about is how it affects everyone. I see a lot of people in the comments like really surprised by the fact that a 2-year-old was affected with a mental illness, and it sees no color, no age, no race, nothing. And it's quite important for us to bring that conversation to the forefront. Another question that I got was, what are the dangers of self-diagnosing yourself? I know of a lot of people that would just go on the internet and just write down their symptoms just to get some sort of an idea of what's wrong with them. So what are the dangers of self-diagnosing?
Yeah, I think that there's some real inherent dangers there. Maybe let me pick up on two, which I think will be helpful for us to find. You see, Dr. Google is not all bad. I think there's a place and space for Dr. Google. And as you say, if it is going to help you initiate some sort of treatment, then go for it. if you put in your symptoms and you get to realize that something might be wrong, and because now everything spies on you and it starts to recommend where to go, and you're able to go, and it's great. Though where it's not helpful for two reasons. One of them is that actually it can contribute to stigma. So what we partly know about stigma is that people then start to mislabel themselves and other people, right? And oftentimes in a very pejorative way or in a not so nice way. So Dr. Google or Googling your symptoms can contribute to you labeling yourself wrong and other people wrong, which actually can be incredibly stigmatizing. It can also contribute to stigma because it undermines the power of certain diagnoses. And we were speaking about this. I know colloquially we all like to say, oh, I'm OCD, or oh, I'm depressed, or oh, I'm, and so on and so forth. But what that does is that it actually erodes the seriousness of all of those diagnoses. That those things are serious and they're diagnosable, and this is the help that those diagnoses need to get. The second one is that it can really impact your ability to get the proper help, actually. So if from the get-go, what it is that you've read is incorrect, you're going to respond in the wrong way, in the incorrect way. So that's, by formula, it's so important for you to know what you're struggling with in a correct way so that you know what to do with it. Alternatively, then you think it's one thing and then you do something which is not actually going to be helpful. So to go to a professional, to reach out to the right type of help is much more important for you, for your prognosis, and for you getting the type of help that you need.
And just to end it off, I think a few lessons, like you taught me recently, on language, on the things that we should and should not say when referring to people that are suffering from depression and so forth, and even suicide. I found myself saying committing suicide, and I know that's not the right terminology. Please just educate us on that.
Sure, and to go back to how we started, is that I think that the most important thing is to be equally kind to ourselves and others as we're figuring out this language thing. We need to kind of get stuck in and realize how far behind we are in order for us to really make the progress that we need. And we will all make mistakes. And mental health is also about being kind to ourselves. I loved what you're saying about small victories, and I really wanted to echo that. And to say that you have to be realistic around what it is that you can do in these times, and actually most of the times to know that you're doing the best that you can. So even when it comes to languaging, to really know that we're doing the best that we can, and then to know how we respond to when we might slip up. I actually, even in this conversation, picked up some of my language which was problematic and a little bit ableist, and I was thinking, okay, I must catch that and do something with it. So it's about throwing ourselves into a space where we can learn. So this is one big lesson. For example, we speak oftentimes about people struggling with a mental illness as opposed to having something. We also speak, for example, about the idea that we no longer use manic depressive, or somebody is not a schizophrenic if they are struggling with their moods in a different day. So knowing that type of stuff is incredibly important. And again, a big topic and lesson you just taught everybody, which is that we are trying to shift away from committing suicide to suicide or died by suicide for the very many different reasons, including removing the sting of it and kind of not making the person who may have succumbed to it or turned to it the perpetrator of something bad, actually, to know that they were suffering. And this languaging we are learning day in and day out, and we'll continue to do that, right? As we should.
No, I hope this was informative for everyone. Thank you so much for this live. And I learned a lot of things. I see a lot of people talking about high functioning depression. I didn't even know about that. A lot of people were very informed about that. So thank you so much for tonight. Thank you so much for all the information that you gave us. This was indeed Mental Health 101. And I'm looking forward to the next Mindful Mondays.
Great. So am I, and thanks to you for putting it on the map and for kind of initiating this conversation. I think it's a really great regular feature for a lot of people, and I know that it will be incredibly helpful, because I know that for somebody, and maybe for some very many hundreds of people who were with us this evening, either they've taken something away which will allow them to get the help that they need, for somebody else to get the help that they need. And I think we've done well in this 45-minute conversation just to also just advocate for mental health and mental health as well.
I think one thing that people just need to remember, take away from this as we end it, is that it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to seek help. You're not alone. I see a lot of people here on this live sharing their stories, sharing their experiences, and I think it's quite important to just remember that you're not alone, and it's okay to not be okay, and it's okay to seek help. There are resources and platforms such as SADAG that are available for you to use in order to get help, or to step in the right direction in terms of getting help. So I really do hope this was informative, and yeah, I'll see you guys next Monday. Thank you so much, Zamo.
Awesome. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.